He's better off dead. It's honestly the best thing that could have happened to this family. That was the sentence I walked into. Not a metaphor. Not something I imagined in the fog of a concussion. My son Craig said it in the vestibule of Holloway Funeral Chapel, low, almost bored, the way a man talks about a delayed flight. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that hallway moved. Somewhere behind the closed doors of the chapel, an organ kept playing the same 4 bars on a loop, patient and oblivious, while 30 feet away his own father stood soaked from the rain, alive, listening to himself get buried a second time. I did not gasp. I did not drop the umbrella I was holding. I only felt my jaw lock, the way a mechanism locks when you force the wrong key into it and something inside gives up trying to turn. 40 years of handling locks teaches you that a mechanism under enough pressure doesn't break loudly. It just stops. That's what I did in that hallway. I stopped, and I listened, and I let my own son finish burying me before if I decided whether I was going to let him. My name is Walter Hayes. I am 63 years old, and for 39 of those years, I was a locksmith and vault restorer in Millbrook, Ohio, the kind of trade that doesn't exist much anymore because nobody trusts an old man with steel nerves and a set of picks over a keypad and an app. I opened my first bank vault at 24. I rebuilt the tumbler mechanism in the county courthouse safe in 1994 after a flood ruined the wiring, and I did it by hand, on my knees, for $6 an hour, because the town couldn't afford the fee a Cleveland firm wanted to charge them. I raised 2 children mostly alone after my wife Eleanor died of cancer 19 years ago, and in the 11 days before I supposedly drowned in the Kettering River, I had already sold my truck, cashed out half my retirement, and quietly co-signed $140,000 in loans to keep my son's investment firm from collapsing. That is the man they buried on a Tuesday in October while I was lying in a rural clinic bed 40 miles upriver, unable to remember my own name. I am not telling you this story, so you feel sorry for an old man. I am telling you because I want you to understand exactly how far a family will let you fall before they decide you're more useful to them gone than standing in front of them, and exactly what a man who has spent his whole life learning how things lock can do about it once he decides he is done being polite. The accident happened on a Thursday night in late September, on Route 9 outside of Millbrook, where the road runs along the river with nothing but a low guardrail and 40 years of rust between the asphalt and the water. I had been out at the Ferris place, installing a restored 1920s floor safe in a farmhouse basement, the kind of job I still took because I liked the quiet of it, the smell of gun oil and old iron, the satisfaction of a mechanism 100 years old clicking shut the way it was built to. I left around 9. It was raining hard enough that the wipers on my truck couldn't keep up. And somewhere on the second curve, past the old grain silo, I felt the back end slide, felt the guardrail catch the truck instead of stopping it, and then there was only cold water, and the sound of my own heartbeat filling my ears like something trying to get out. I don't remember the river. I don't remember climbing out, though the search team later found scrape marks on the bank, consistent with a man dragging himself out of the current about a mile downstream. I don't remember the 2 days I apparently spent wandering along the tree line in the storm, concussed, hypothermic, unable to speak in full sentences, until a hunter named Dwayne Pruitt found me half-conscious in a drainage ditch behind his property and drove me to the nearest clinic instead of waiting for an ambulance that was 40 minutes out. What I remember starts 3 days later, in a hospital bed in a town I didn't recognize, staring at a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped like Ohio, unable to tell the nurse standing over me anything more than my own first name, and not even that with much confidence. They didn't find my truck for 6 days. When they did, it was wedged against a fallen tree half a mile downstream from where I'd gone in, driver's door open, windshield shattered, one work boot lodged under the passenger seat. There was no body. The Kettering River in late September, after 4 days of rain, runs high and fast and cold, and the search and rescue captain told my family gently that in conditions like that, recovery sometimes simply doesn't happen. Sometimes a body doesn't come back. Sometimes the river just keeps it. My daughter Nora told me later that she stood at that guardrail for 2 hours in the rain, refusing to leave, while my son stood 20 feet behind her, on the phone, already talking to someone about paperwork. That should have been my first warning about the distance between my two children. It wasn't the last. Craig is 38. He runs an investment advisory firm 2 towns over, the kind with his name in gold letters on frosted glass and a lobby that smells like money and ambition. And for the last 3 years I had watched him build that firm on a foundation that got shakier every time I visited. I am not an educated man in the way Craig is. I never finished a business degree. But I know what desperation sounds like in a man's voice when he asks his father for another loan and swears every single time that this is the last one. This is the one that fixes everything. I had heard that sentence from my son 11 times in 3 years. I believed it 11 times because he was my son, and because somewhere in the part of a father's chest that never quite grows a callus, I kept hoping the 12th time would be true. Nora is 34, a trauma nurse at St. Agnes in Millbrook, married to a good, quiet man named Desmond, and mother to my grandson Eli, who is 8 years old and asks questions with the kind of blunt honesty that only an 8-year-old can survive asking. Nora never once asked me for money. In 19 years of raising 2 children alone after Eleanor died, Nora asked me for exactly one thing: help changing a flat tire the week she got her nursing license. And Craig asked me for $140,000 in 11 days. I want to be honest about something, because if I'm not, none of what follows will make sense. I let this happen. I am not writing a story where I am blameless and my son fell from the sky already broken. For years, every time Craig failed, I was there with a checkbook before he even had to feel the floor. I told myself I was protecting him. What I was actually doing was making sure he never once, not a single time in 38 years, had to sit alone in a room and face a consequence he'd earned on his own. I built a safety net so wide and so soft that my son forgot nets were supposed to have edges. That mistake belongs to me, and later in this story I said it to his face. Not to excuse what he did, but because a man my age has learned that the truth doesn't stop hurting less just because you keep it to yourself. 3 weeks. That's how long I spent as an unidentified patient in a 14-bed rural clinic in a town called Sutter's Creek, 40 miles from Millbrook, too far and too small to be on anyone's search radius. My speech came back slowly, in pieces, the way a lock yields when the pins are damaged and you're working blind, feeling for what should click and finding only resistance. My name came back on day 9. My address came back on day 12. It took until day 16 for me to be well enough and coherent enough to convince the clinic staff that yes, I understood my own social security number, and no, I was not confused about the year, and yes, I would like someone to please call my daughter. Here is the detail I did not understand until much later. The detail that changed everything about how I saw those 3 weeks. Someone had called Sutter's Creek Clinic on day 4, asking about an unidentified male patient matching my description. The clinic's intake log showed the call clearly. A man's voice, no name given, hanging up after 2 questions before the nurse could even finish pulling my chart. Day 4. 9 days before I could tell anyone who I was, someone already knew I might be alive. In a clinic 40 miles away, and said nothing to my daughter. Said nothing to the sheriff still running search patterns along the Kettering, and instead let the county move forward, 12 days later, with an official petition of presumed death. I did not know that detail on the day I walked into my own memorial. I only found out 4 days after, when a legal aid volunteer named Priya Anand, who'd been assigned to help me untangle my identity paperwork, pulled the clinic's phone log at my request and went very quiet reading it. But I am telling you now, so that everything Craig said in that vestibule, everything that came after, lands the way it's supposed to. Because a man who panics and jumps to a wrong assumption is one kind of son. A man who gets a phone call telling him his father might be alive and chooses silence instead. Because silence is more convenient for $140,000 of debt, is an entirely different kind of son, and by the time I understood which kind I had already decided what I was going to do about it. The petition for presumption of death is a real legal process in Ohio, and it is not something a family can simply invent out of grief. It requires an affidavit, a sworn statement of circumstances, evidence from search and rescue, and typically a waiting period, though a court can shorten that period if the circumstances, like a body never recovered from a fast-moving river in flood conditions, support urgency. Craig filed on day 11, 6 days after they found my truck, 5 days after that unnamed phone call to the clinic. He had an estate attorney drafted inside a week. My trust, the one Eleanor and I set up together 22 years ago, the one that named Craig and Nora as equal successor trustees only in the event of my death, listed my home, my retirement accounts, and a life insurance policy worth $200,000 with Craig's firm as a secondary beneficiary for business continuity, a clause I'd signed years earlier during better days, never imagining it would become the fastest door in the building. The judge granted an expedited hearing on day 14. By day 16, the very same day I finally said my own name out loud in a clinic bed 40 miles away, the court had entered a preliminary finding of presumed death, and the insurance company had already opened a claim file. I did not know any of this yet. I only knew that on day 19, discharged, weak, walking with a cane, a physical therapist at Sutter's Creek had given me because my left leg still buckled. Without warning, I hitched a ride with a clinic volunteer named Rosalind, who was driving toward Millbrook to visit her sister, and I asked her, in a voice still rough as gravel, to drop me at Holloway Funeral Chapel on Route 12, because something in my chest, something I couldn't name yet, told me that was where I needed to go first, before home, before calling anyone, before anything. I did not know it yet, but I was about to walk into the one room in the world where every person who mattered to me was already gathered, already grieving, already deciding, out loud, what my death was worth to them. The chapel parking lot was full when Rosalind pulled up, more cars than I expected for a man who spent most of his life quietly fixing other people's locks. I told her she didn't need to wait, thanked her, and stood under the portico a moment, letting the rain run off the borrowed coat the clinic had given me, gathering whatever was left of my strength before I opened that door. That's when I heard voices in the side vestibule, low, not meant to carry, but carrying anyway the way voices do in a building built for acoustics meant for grief, not privacy. He's better off dead. It's honestly the best thing that could have happened to this family. Craig's voice. And after it, a second voice. Sharper, colder, a voice I recognized as my daughter-in-law Deborah's. Careful, someone will hear you. And Craig, laughing, actually laughing, a short, dry sound with nothing warm left in it. Who's going to hear me? He's dead, Deb. The only person who ever heard anything in this family was him, and he can't hear a thing anymore. I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. I didn't, not yet. What I felt was the floor of my whole life quietly giving way, the specific, precise sensation of a man realizing that 38 years of sacrifice had been filed away by his own son under the word inconvenient. I stood in that vestibule, soaked, holding a cane I didn't yet know how to walk properly with, and I let that sentence sink all the way into the part of me that had spent a lifetime learning to feel for exactly where a mechanism was weakest, before I ever touched a tool to it. Then I opened the door and walked into my own memorial. The room went silent in a way I have never experienced before or since, a silence with a physical weight to it, like the pressure change before a storm. Nora saw me first. She was standing near the front, beside an easel holding a photograph of me at Eli's 7th birthday, and the sound that came out of her wasn't a scream and wasn't a sob. It was something in between, something I felt in my own chest before I understood I'd caused it. She crossed that room faster than I have ever seen another human being move, and she hit me hard enough that my cane clattered to the floor, both arms locked around my ribs, saying my name over and over into my shoulder like she was trying to convince her own body it was true. Behind her, I watched my son's face do something I will remember until the day I actually do die. It wasn't joy. For just a fraction of a second, before every muscle in his face caught up and rearranged itself into something that could pass for shock, I watched Craig Hayes look at his living father the way you'd look at a bill you thought you'd already paid, arriving again in the mail. Ellie, my grandson, small and confused in a borrowed dark suit, 2 sizes too big, tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked the only question that mattered in that entire room, the question none of the adults, myself included, had the courage to ask out loud. Mommy, if Grandpa's not dead, why did everybody stop being sad so fast? Nobody answered him. I have thought about that question every day since. Because it wasn't stopped being sad. It was stopped being sad and started being afraid. And an 8-year-old, standing in a room full of adults who'd built entire financial futures on my absence, was the only one honest enough to notice the difference. I did not confront Craig that day. I know that surprises people when I tell this story, because everyone expects the wronged man to turn immediately, to demand answers in front of the whole chapel, to make a scene worthy of what he just heard. But I had spent 39 years learning that you never force a lock while it's under tension. You wait. You let the pressure find its own weakest point, and then you apply exactly the right amount of force to exactly the right place. And the whole mechanism gives way clean, with no one able to say you broke anything that wasn't already broken. I let Nora take me home. I let the funeral director, a decent man named Arthur Kowalski, who looked more shaken by my appearance than anyone else in the building, quietly begin the paperwork to reverse a memorial he'd been paid. In advance. Entirely from an insurance claim that hadn't even finished processing, and I said exactly 4 words to my son before I left that chapel. We'll talk soon, Craig. He didn't sleep that night. I found that out later, from Deborah, in a conversation neither of us expected to have. But I did. I slept better that first night home than I had in months, because for the first time since Eleanor died, I understood with complete clarity exactly who I was dealing with, and exactly what a man who builds vaults for a living does when he finally decides someone doesn't deserve to know the combination anymore. That first night in my own house, the house I had built the frame of with my own hands in 1987, back when lumber was cheap, and my back didn't complain about it, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me and tried to do something I have done 10,000 times without thinking. I tried to open a simple brass padlock, an old one I keep on a hook by the door out of habit more than need, the kind with a 5-pin tumbler I could pick blind in under 30 seconds when I was 25. My hands would not stop shaking. Not from the cold, not from the concussion, though the doctor at Sutter's Creek had warned me tremors might linger for a while. It was something else. Something that had nothing to do with the accident and everything to do with the sound of my son's voice in that vestibule. I sat there for 11 minutes failing to open a lock. I could have opened in my sleep a month earlier. And when I finally set it down, I put my forehead against the cold kitchen table and let myself feel, just for a few minutes, exactly how small a man can feel in a house he built himself. I don't tell people that part of the story often. It isn't the part that makes a good ending. But I think it matters, because for 38 years I had let everyone in my family believe I was simply a patient man, a giving man, someone whose calm never cracked. The truth is, calmer men than me have cracked over less. I cracked that night, alone, over a padlock. And then I picked myself back up off that table, because Nora was asleep down the hall with her hand still holding onto the sleeve of my coat, like she was afraid I'd disappear again if she let go. And because somewhere underneath the shaking, a much older, much steadier part of me was already starting to work. Nora had told me everything on the drive home from the chapel, the words tumbling out of her faster than she could organize them. The petition. The insurance claim already filed. The trust documents Craig's attorney had drafted for an expedited transfer the moment the presumption of death was granted. She hadn't known about most of it until 2 days before the memorial, when Craig finally told her the paperwork was moving and she'd need to sign as co-trustee to release funds for what he called final arrangements. A phrase that, I would later learn, covered considerably more than a chapel rental and a photograph on an easel. I told him it felt wrong to move that fast, Nora said, gripping the steering wheel hard enough that her knuckles went pale under the dashboard lights. He said the bank was pressuring him. He said if the transfer didn't clear by the end of the month, the firm would lose its line of credit, and 40 people would lose their jobs. I didn't want 40 families to suffer because we were being cautious, Dad. I didn't want to be the reason people lost their livelihoods over paperwork. That was the sentence that told me everything about how carefully Craig had built his justification before he ever needed to use it. He hadn't asked his sister to trust him. He'd handed her a weight to carry, 40 invented families, and let her carry it, so she wouldn't ask the one question that actually mattered, which was why her brother was in such a screaming hurry to convert their father's presumed death into liquid cash before the body had even had the decency to be found. I did not sleep past 4 the next morning. Old habits from 39 years of early jobs don't leave a man just because he spent 3 weeks in a hospital bed. I made coffee, sat at that same kitchen table, and this time, instead of reaching for the padlock, I reached for the phone and called a number the clinic's discharge coordinator had given me before I left Sutter's Creek, for a legal aid office 2 counties over that helped people untangle exactly the kind of bureaucratic knot I now found myself standing in the middle of. A young woman named Priya Anand answered on the 3rd ring, and when I told her, as plainly as I could manage, that I was a man who had just walked into his own memorial service after being legally presumed dead 11 days into a probate process my own son had filed, she was quiet for a long moment before she said the sentence that set the entire next month of my life into motion. Mr. Hayes, I need you to understand something right now before we talk about anything else. You are, as of this morning, still legally deceased in the eyes of the state of Ohio. Until we fix that, on paper, you don't exist. Which means whatever your son does with your assets in the next few days, while that finding is still active, is going to be a lot harder to undo than you think. I asked her what I needed to do. She told me the first thing, the only thing that mattered before anything else. Get to the courthouse, in person, with identification, before the close of business, and file for immediate vacatur of the presumption of death. Everything else, she said, the trust, the insurance claim, whatever Craig was planning to do with 40 invented jobs riding on top of it, would have to wait its turn behind that one piece of paper. I looked at my hands on that kitchen table, still faintly trembling, and I made a decision that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the only skill I have ever truly trusted in myself. I was not going to walk into that courthouse, or into my son's office, or into any room in this fight, without first understanding exactly how the mechanism worked. Every lock has a story. Every vault has a weak point. Usually not where you'd expect it, usually somewhere the owner assumed nobody would ever think to look. I had spent my whole life finding those points for other people's benefit. It was time to find one for my own. Give me the address, I told Priya. I'll be there in an hour. The Millbrook County Courthouse hadn't changed since I rebuilt its vault mechanism 30 years ago. Same limestone steps, worn smooth in the middle. Same brass handrail I'd once repaired myself after a winter storm cracked the mounting bolts. Priya Anand met me on those steps, a small woman in her late 20s with a leather folder under one arm, and the particular calm of someone who has learned not to let other people's emergencies become her own panic. She looked at me for a moment before we went inside, really looked, the way people had started looking at me since the chapel, like they were checking whether I was going to hold together or come apart in front of them. Mr. Hayes, she said, I want to prepare you for something. Vacating a presumption of death isn't hard when the presumed person walks in alive with valid identification. That part we can do today. What's harder is what happens after. Once the finding is reversed and the money that already moved has to be traced and pulled back. I need you to understand that your son may have already spent some of it, or moved it somewhere that makes it harder to recover. I don't want you walking in there expecting a clean, easy fix. I told her I hadn't expected clean or easy from the moment I opened that vestibule door. I had spent my whole working life understanding that nothing worth protecting ever comes with an easy lock on it. If it did, it wouldn't need protecting. The hearing took 40 minutes. I sat in a wooden chair that had probably held 1,000 men with worse problems than mine, produced my driver's license, my social security card, a hospital discharge form from Sutter's Creek with my photograph stapled to it, and a fingerprint card the county clerk pulled from an old employment file, because 30 years ago the courthouse itself had required a background check before letting a locksmith anywhere near its vault. Judge Marsh, a heavy-set woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, looked at the paperwork, looked at me, and said the sentence I will remember for the rest of whatever life I have left. Mr. Hayes, on behalf of this court, I apologize for the inconvenience of your own death. The presumption is vacated, effective immediately. Welcome back. There was a ripple of quiet laughter in the courtroom, the nervous kind, the kind that comes when everyone in a room realizes something is both absurd and completely serious at the same time. I did not laugh. I thanked the judge, and I asked the clerk, before I left, for one specific thing: a certified copy of the full court file, every document Craig's attorney had submitted to support the original petition, because I had learned a long time ago that if you want to understand where a lock is weakest, you start by reading the blueprint the person who installed it left behind. That file told me more about my son in 20 pages than 3 years of loans had told me in person. The petition itself was standard, grief-worn language any competent estate attorney could draft in an afternoon, but the supporting financial affidavit, the one required to justify the expedited hearing, was where I found the first thread. Craig's firm, Hayes Meridian Advisory, had listed an outstanding line of credit with Third Bascom Bank that was, according to the affidavit's own numbers, 90 days delinquent, not simply pressured, as Nora had been told, but already in default, with the bank's workout department scheduled to begin formal collection proceedings in 11 days. The insurance payout and the trust transfer weren't meant to save 40 jobs from a hypothetical future squeeze. They were meant to clear a default that had already happened, quietly, weeks before I ever went into that river. The second thread was smaller, easy to miss if you weren't the kind of man who reads fine print for a living. The affidavit had been co-signed as a supporting witness by someone named Todd Ferron, listed as a senior partner at Hayes Meridian. I didn't recognize the name from any of Craig's visits over the years, but Priya, scanning the same page beside me, went very still. "Todd Ferron," she said slowly. "I know that name, not from your case. From another file I closed last spring, a small business fraud claim against a different firm 2 counties over. He was the compliance officer there before it folded under an investigation that got quietly dropped when the complaining client withdrew her statement." She looked up at me. "I don't know what that means for you yet, Mr. Hayes. But a man with that history doesn't become a senior partner at your son's firm by accident, and he doesn't co-sign a death petition out of the goodness of his heart." I did not go to Craig's office that day. I went home first, because there was one thing I needed to do before I confronted anyone, something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment I stood in that kitchen failing to open a padlock. 22 years ago, the same year Eleanor and I set up our trust, I built something into this house that only 2 people ever knew existed, because I built it with my own hands in a single week, while Eleanor was at her sister's recovering from her first round of chemotherapy, and I never told our children, not because I didn't trust them, but because Eleanor asked me not to. Some things, she told me, holding my hand in a hospital chair that smelled like antiseptic and fear, should only open for the right reason, Walter, not the easy one. Behind the false back of the linen closet in our bedroom, sealed into the wall itself, sits a floor safe I built from a Diebold body salvaged from a demolished bank branch outside of Dayton, restored by hand, with a combination mechanism I designed myself and never wrote down anywhere except inside my own memory. Inside it, wrapped in a cedar box Eleanor had once used for her sewing supplies, is a letter she wrote me 11 days before she died, sealed, addressed to me, that I had never once, in 19 years, found the courage to open. I stood in front of that linen closet for a long time before I moved the panel aside. My hands, for the first time since the chapel, had stopped shaking. I did not open the letter that day. I want to be honest about that, because it would make for a tidier story if the letter had contained some perfect prophecy about Craig's betrayal that I could wave in front of him like proof from beyond the grave. It didn't, and it wouldn't have, because Eleanor never claimed to see the future, only to worry, in the particular way a dying mother worries, about the things she wouldn't be there to say out loud. What I did that day was simply confirm the safe still worked, that the combination still lived where I'd left it, in the muscle memory of my own hands, and that whatever I decided to do next, I had a place in this house that no one else could reach without me choosing to let them in. That felt, For the first time in 3 weeks, like solid ground, I went to Craig's office 2 days later on a Thursday. Exactly the kind of gray, drizzling afternoon that seemed to follow every important conversation in this story. Hayes Meridian Advisory occupied the second floor of a renovated bank building in Ashworth, 20 minutes from Millbrook, with his name etched in gold on the frosted glass door, exactly the way I'd pictured it 100 times with pride, and now looked at with something closer to grief. The receptionist, a young woman who clearly hadn't been told her boss's father had returned from the dead, went pale enough that I worried she might need a chair. Craig came out of his office fast, too fast, already talking before the door finished swinging. Dad, I've been trying to call you for 2 days. I wanted to explain everything. I know how it looked. Sit down, Craig. I didn't raise my voice. I have never needed to raise my voice at my son to get his attention, which is, I understand now, part of how we got here. He sat. Deborah appeared in the doorway of an adjoining office a moment later, arms crossed, and behind her, a man I'd never met, silver-templed, expensive suit, the kind of easy, unbothered posture that comes from a lifetime of watching other people panic while he stays perfectly still. Todd Ferran, I assumed correctly before anyone said his name. I read the court file, I told my son. The whole thing. I know about the default with Third Bascom. I know the collection proceedings were 11 days out. I know this was never about 40 jobs, Craig. It was about a hole you'd already dug, and you needed my death to be real enough, fast enough, to fill it before the bank found out how deep it actually went. Craig's face did something complicated. Shame trying to fight its way past a much stronger instinct towards self-preservation and losing. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Todd told me the insurance would clear in 10 business days if the presumption went through clean. It was supposed to buy us time, that's all, just time. And then once the firm stabilized, I was going to make it right, every dollar. You buried me to buy yourself time. I let that sentence sit in the room exactly as long as it needed to. Your own father. Not because you believed I was dead. Because it was more useful to you if I was. That was when Deborah, still standing in the doorway, said the sentence that told me exactly what kind of daughter-in-law I had raised my son to marry. Eleanor would understand, Walter. She always understood family comes first. She'd want Craig protected, whatever it took. I have absorbed a great many things in my life without flinching. I absorbed poverty as a boy. I absorbed my wife's diagnosis without letting her see me break. I absorbed my son's laughter in that vestibule, calling me better off dead, and I stayed standing. But hearing Eleanor's name used as a shield for exactly the kind of behavior she spent her last conscious weeks warning me to guard against, that was the first moment in this entire story that I felt something close to true anger, cold and clear instead of hot. Don't, I said, and something in my voice made even Todd Ferran's easy posture shift slightly against the doorframe. You do not get to speak my wife's name in this room, Deborah. You didn't know her well enough to guess what she'd want, and I promise you, whatever she'd want, it was never this. Craig, to his credit, or perhaps simply to save himself, put a hand up between Deborah and me, a small gesture, but the first genuinely protective thing I'd seen him do for anyone but himself in this entire ordeal. Deb, don't. Just don't. Then, to me, quieter, some of the performance falling away from his voice for the first time since I'd walked in. I know what I did. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't. I just need you to understand I didn't wake up one morning and decide to profit off my own father's death. It happened one bad decision at a time, and by the time I could see how far I'd gone, it felt easier to keep walking than to turn around and face what I'd have to explain. I believe that, actually. Not as an excuse, but as an explanation, the kind that made this whole story sadder rather than simpler, because underneath the greed and the default and the ugly sentence in that vestibule, I recognized something in my son that I had spent 38 years building without meaning to. A man who had never once had to turn around and face a consequence, because his father was always standing behind him with a checkbook, absorbing the impact before it ever reached him. I did not say that to Craig in his office that day. That admission belonged to a different room, a different moment, one that was still weeks away. But I felt it settle into me, heavy and true, the way you feel the weight of a safe before you've even finished lifting it. Todd Ferran spoke for the first time since I'd walked in, and his voice had the smooth, unhurried quality of a man who has talked his way out of worse rooms than this one. Mr. Hayes, I understand this is an emotional reunion, and I don't want to intrude on a family matter, but I'll say, professionally, that everything done regarding the estate proceeding was within the bounds of what the law allows, given the circumstances your family was facing. Grief makes people move quickly. That's not a crime. No, I agreed. It isn't. But a phone call to a clinic in Sutter's Creek on day 4 of my disappearance, asking about an unidentified male patient matching my description, and then hanging up without leaving a name or telling a single soul, while the county spent the next 12 days building a legal case for my death. That's a different question entirely, isn't it, Mr. Ferran? And I intend to find out exactly whose voice was on that call. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, fast, controlled, but not fast enough. It was the first real crack I'd seen in Todd Ferran, and it told me everything I needed to know about where the true weak point of this whole mechanism was actually hiding. Not in my son's desperation, which was ordinary and almost forgivable, but in a much colder calculation sitting one door down the hall in an office, with his own name nowhere on the frosted glass. I left Hayes Meridian that afternoon without another word, walked down 2 flights of stairs into the drizzle, and stood on the sidewalk a long moment before I understood why my hands, for the first time in days, had gone perfectly steady. I had spent 19 days since the river reacting to what had already been done to me. Standing on that sidewalk, I understood I was finally ready to start deciding what happened next. Nora had insisted I move into her guest room instead of staying alone in the house those first weeks, and I hadn't fought her on it. Partly for the company, partly, if I'm honest, because some part of me was still afraid of what it might feel like to sleep alone in a house I'd nearly died coming home to. That evening, Eli found me sitting on the back porch steps, staring out at nothing in particular, and climbed up beside me without asking permission the way only an 8-year-old can. "Grandpa," he said, after a while, in the careful tone of a kid working up to a real question, "were you scared? In the river?" "I don't remember the river, buddy. That's the strange part. I remember before, and I remember after, but the middle's just gone." He thought about that with the seriousness only children bring to genuinely difficult problems. "Uncle Craig said you probably don't remember because your brain was protecting you. He said, sometimes people forget the scary parts on purpose. Your Uncle Craig might be right about that." Eli picked at a loose thread on his shoe for a moment, and then asked the question that undid something in my chest I hadn't realized was still holding tight. "Are you going to forgive him? For the mean thing he said?" I did not have a ready answer for that, not one I trusted, not from an 8-year-old's honest face turned up toward mine in the porch light. "I don't know yet, son. I think forgiveness and forgetting are 2 different things, and I haven't figured out yet how much of the first one I can give your uncle without doing the second." He nodded slowly, like that made sense to him in the specific, uncomplicated way children accept things. Adults are still years from understanding. And then he leaned his head against my arm and didn't say anything else, and we sat there together until Nora called us both in for dinner. And for a few minutes at least, I let myself feel like a man who still had something worth protecting instead of something to prove. That night, after Eli was asleep, Nora sat across from me at her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea neither of us finished, and told me something she'd been sitting on since the chapel. "I need to tell you what I heard, Dad." I didn't say anything before because I wasn't sure it mattered, but after today, after what you told me about the phone call, I think it does. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "The morning of the memorial, before you arrived, I walked past Deborah in the parking lot. She was on her phone and she didn't see me. She said, and I remember this exactly because it made my skin crawl at the time, and I didn't understand why, she said, 'It's handled, Todd. By tomorrow this is finished, and nobody's going to ask any more questions about where the money went.'" I sat with that sentence for a long moment, letting it settle into place beside everything else I'd learned that day. The default, the 11-day countdown, Todd Ferran's flicker of fear on the word Sutter's Creek. Somewhere underneath my son's desperate, ordinary greed, there was a second mechanism turning, colder and more deliberate, one that had been running long before I ever went off that road, and I understood, sitting in my daughter's kitchen with cold tea going untouched between us, that finding out exactly what Todd Ferran and Deborah had handled was going to matter a great deal more than anything Craig himself had done. I'm going to need your help with something, I told Nora. Not money, not signatures, just your memory and your patience, because I think this is bigger than a bad loan and a rushed petition, and I want to understand the whole mechanism before I touch a single piece of it. She reached across the table and took my hand, the same way she had in that chapel doorway, like she was still making sure I was real. Whatever you need, Dad. I already lost you once this month. I'm not interested in losing you to caution instead. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I drove out to see an old friend, a man named Sal Petrosino, who'd taught me half of what I know about vault mechanisms back when we were both young enough to think our knees would last forever. Sal had retired from the trade a decade before me, but he still kept a workshop behind his house, still fielded calls from 3 counties around whenever a town needed a 100-year-old safe opened without dynamite. I hadn't called ahead. I didn't need to. Sal took one look at me standing in his driveway, cane in hand, still moving like a man not quite trusting his own legs, and didn't ask a single question about the accident, about the river, about any of it. He just said, "Come on in, Walt. Coffee on," the way he'd said it 1,000 times over 40 years, like nothing in the world had changed, which was, I think, exactly what I needed to hear that morning. Word had gotten around Millbrook fast, the way it does in a town small enough that everybody's second cousin works the register at the same grocery store. By the time I sat down at Sal's kitchen table, he already knew most of it. The memorial, the presumption of death, even some of the numbers, because his nephew worked as a clerk at the county courthouse and hadn't been able to keep his mouth shut about the strangest case he'd processed all year. Sal didn't say much about Craig. He didn't need to. What he did instead was set a key on the table in front of me, an old brass key I recognized instantly, one I'd cut myself for his workshop safe 15 years earlier. "You need anything," Sal said. "Tools, a place to think. Somebody to sit with you that isn't family and isn't going to ask you to explain yourself. That door's open. Always has been. Don't matter if you use it or not. I just want you to know it's there." I didn't cry in front of Sal that morning, but it was closer than it had been at any point since the chapel, because in a month where I'd learned exactly how far my own blood was willing to let me fall, an old man I hadn't spoken to in over a year had just handed me a key to his life without me asking for a single thing. By the time I left his driveway an hour later, 3 more calls had come in on my cell phone, men I'd trained, men I'd fixed safes alongside for decades, men who'd heard through the same small-town current that Walter Hayes had come back from the dead and needed to know they still had his back. Nobody asked for details. Nobody wanted anything from me. They just wanted me to know I wasn't standing in this alone, and there is a particular kind of strength that comes from that, quieter than anger, steadier than grief, the kind that doesn't announce itself with speeches, just shows up in a driveway at 7 in the morning with a key and a pot of coffee already on. That afternoon, Priya connected me with a forensic accountant she trusted, a careful, unhurried woman named Marguerite Okafor who made one thing clear before she agreed to look at anything. "I only work with documents you already have lawful access to, Mr. Hayes. Court filings, bank statements in your own name, anything your son or his partner has voluntarily shown you or filed publicly. I'm not going to hack into anyone's accounts, and frankly, I wouldn't trust the results if someone offered to do that for you. Everything we build has to survive being read out loud in a courtroom by someone trying to tear it apart." I told her that suited me fine. I had spent 39 years building things that were meant to last under pressure, not things that only looked solid until somebody pushed. Whatever we found, I wanted it to hold. It took Marguerite Okafor 11 days to build a picture clear enough to hand to anyone, and in those 11 days I learned more about patience than I had in 63 years of practicing it. She worked from public filings first, the Ohio Division of Securities, keeps a searchable record of complaints and disciplinary actions, and what she found there confirmed what Priya had already suspected. Todd Farran had been the subject of a formal complaint filed 18 months earlier by a former client of his previous firm, a widow named Constance Byerly, who alleged he'd steered her retirement savings into a series of shell investment vehicles that existed mostly on paper, skimming management fees off transactions that never should have happened in the first place. The complaint had gone quiet after Mrs. Byerly withdrew her statement, but it had never been formally closed, only shelved, sitting in a state investigator's backlog waiting for a second complaint that would give it enough weight to move forward. Marguerite found the second complaint 3 days into her work. It had been filed 11 months earlier by a former junior associate at Hayes Meridian named Priscilla Wren, who'd quit the firm abruptly and reported irregular transfers she'd noticed between 3 client trust accounts and a limited liability company called Cardinal Point Holdings, registered in Delaware, with a mailing address that traced back to a private mailbox rental store 2 towns from Ashworth. Cardinal Point Holdings had one listed officer, not Craig, Todd Farran. "Your son's name is nowhere on the Cardinal Point paperwork," Marguerite told me, spreading 3 years of transaction summaries across her office table, each column marked in the careful, unhurried handwriting of someone who had clearly learned the hard way never to let a single number go unverified. "That doesn't mean he's innocent of the death petition or the pressure to move fast. But it means the actual siphoning of client funds, the thing that's going to interest the state investigator most, was built entirely around your son's signing authority without his direct knowledge of where the money ultimately landed. Todd used Craig's firm as the pipe. He never let your son see the drain." I asked her the question that had been sitting under my ribs since the moment I read Todd Farran's name on that affidavit. "And Deborah?" Marguerite slid one more document across the table, a series of wire transfer records, 6 of them over the past year, each one a modest amount, never large enough by itself to draw serious attention, moving from a personal account belonging to Todd Farran into an account in Deborah's maiden name, one Craig, as far as anyone could tell, had no knowledge existed. "I can't tell you what these payments were for," Marguerite said carefully. "The memo lines just say consulting fees. I can tell you the pattern of a young woman running a legitimate consulting business rarely looks like this. And I can tell you Mr. Farran's calendar, which became part of the public record in the Byerly complaint, shows a great many evening meetings scheduled with your daughter-in-law over the past 14 months, at locations that have nothing to do with financial planning." I sat with that for a long time in Marguerite's quiet office, the ceiling fan turning slow overhead, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not vindication, not even anger, but a strange, heavy sadness settling into the same place where the truth about my own part in Craig's failures had settled 2 weeks earlier. Because whatever Deborah had done, whatever cold calculation had let her stand in a chapel vestibule and call me better off dead, I understood now that she too had likely been a piece being moved by a much steadier hand than her own, a hand that had been running this exact play, in one form or another, since long before Craig Hayes or his father had ever crossed Todd Farran's path. The final piece came from a place I never expected. Arthur Kowalski, the funeral director who'd stood pale and shaken in that chapel doorway the day I walked back into my own memorial, called me 2 weeks after the service, apologetic, careful with his words the way a man is when he's about to hand you something he's not sure you want. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know if this matters to you at all, and I want to say up front, I only kept it because our chapel policy is to record every service for families who can't make it in person. We've done that for 15 years, standard practice. Everybody signs off on it when they book. But I was going through the archive to close out your file properly since you're not deceased, and I found the cassette from your memorial. Our sound booth's still running on an old analog backup system alongside the digital one, has been since before I bought the place. I listened to it before I called you, because I wanted to know if there was anything on there you'd want. And Mr. Hayes, I think you should hear the whole thing. Not just what you already know was said in that vestibule. He drove the cassette out to Nora's house himself 2 days later, a small black rectangle in a paper sleeve with the date written on it in his own handwriting, and set it on the kitchen table like it weighed more than it did. We played it that evening. Nora, Priya, and I gathered around an old cassette player Sal had dug out of his workshop and heard, underneath the vestibule conversation I already knew by heart, a second exchange that had happened nearly an hour later, in the same hallway after most of the mourners had gone home. Deborah's voice, tighter, more frightened than the cold confidence she'd shown in that first recording, and Todd's, patient, controlled, the voice of a man managing an asset rather than comforting a partner. "He's alive, Todd. What do we do?" "We do nothing. The petition's public record now. It takes weeks to formally reverse, longer for anyone to audit the accounts. That's more than enough time. Enough time for what?" A pause on the tape, long enough that I could hear the hallway's old radiator ticking in the background. "Enough time for me to be somewhere the Ohio Division of Securities isn't looking, Deb. I'd suggest you start thinking about the same thing, honestly, before anyone starts asking who signed off on Cardinal Point." That was the sound, on an old cassette tape recorded by a chapel sound booth for entirely unrelated reasons, of a man revealing to the woman he'd been quietly using that she had never been his partner in anything, only his exit strategy, expendable the moment the weather changed. I watched Nora's face as she listened, watched something complicated move across it. Not quite sympathy for Deborah, not quite satisfaction either. Just the particular exhaustion of understanding how many people can get hurt inside a single act of greed, and how rarely the person doing the most damage is the one who ends up paying for it first. "We take this to the investigator," Priya said quietly, once the tape had clicked off. "All of it. The Byerly complaint, the Wren complaint, Marguerite's transaction summaries, and this. Not to Craig's attorney, not to a private mediator. Straight to the state, so it's on the record and it's out of any one family's hands to bury a second time." I agreed, though something in me hesitated for just a moment before I said so out loud, because I understood that handing this tape to a state investigator meant I could no longer control exactly how the story unfolded from here, and a man who spends his life building things that lock precisely the way he intends them to has to learn, eventually, that some doors are better opened by someone else's hand. The investigator, a methodical, soft-spoken man named Agent Rourke from the Ohio Division of Securities, met with Priya and me 4 days later and spent most of the meeting simply listening, taking notes in a small spiral pad, asking careful questions about chain of custody for the cassette and the court file, the kind of questions that told me he'd built cases like this before and knew exactly which details would matter later in a courtroom. He didn't promise me anything about timelines. What he told me instead, near the end of that meeting, was the sentence that made the whole ordeal feel, for the first time, like it was moving toward something other than more damage. "Mr. Hayes, based on what you've brought me, combined with the Wren complaint already on file, I have enough to open a formal investigation into Cardinal Point Holdings and Mr. Ferran's conduct at Hayes Meridian. I want to be honest with you. Cases like this move slowly, and your son's exposure will depend heavily on how cooperative he is from this point forward. If he comes to us voluntarily with everything he knows about Ferran's instructions, that matters. If he waits for us to come to him, that also matters in the opposite direction." I called Craig that night. I did not soften what I told him. I explained the Byerly complaint, the Wren complaint, Cardinal Point Holdings, the wire transfers to Deborah's maiden name, and the cassette, all of it, in the same plain, unhurried voice I use when I'm explaining to a customer exactly why their old lock finally failed. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when I finished, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Deb's been," he started and started again. "How long have you known? About her and Todd?" "I only just found out myself, son. I'm sorry. I know that's not a small thing to learn on top of everything else." Another silence, and then, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from my 38-year-old son, since he was small enough to hold onto my leg at the door, waiting for me to leave for work. "I built that whole firm because I wanted you to be proud of me, the way you were proud of your own work, Dad. Every safe, every job you talked about at dinner, you always sounded like you were building something that would outlast you. I wanted that too. And instead, I let a man like Todd Ferran walk into my office and turn it into something I don't even recognize anymore. I thought, in that moment, about the padlock I'd failed to open that first night home, about 11 loans in 3 years, and a father who'd never once let his son sit alone in a room with a consequence. I built you a life where you never had to feel the floor, Craig. I thought that was love. I'm starting to understand it might have just been fear, mine, not yours. Fear of watching you struggle the way I struggled as a boy. I don't know yet how much of what happened to you is because of that. But I know some of it is, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make either of us feel better tonight. He didn't respond to that right away, and when he did, his voice had steadied into something I hadn't heard from him in years, not confidence exactly, but a kind of tired honesty that felt, for the first time this whole ordeal, like the beginning of an actual man standing where a performance used to be. I'm going to call Agent Rourke myself tomorrow, before he has to come find me. I want that on the record, Dad, that I came to him first once I knew. Not because it makes anything I did okay, because it's the first true thing I've done in this whole mess, and I'd like there to be one. I told him that was the right call, and I meant it. And I hung up the phone that night feeling something I hadn't expected to feel toward my son in weeks. Not forgiveness yet. That was still its own separate mountain I hadn't finished climbing. But something adjacent to it. A willingness to keep the door open long enough to see whether he'd actually walk through it. Elenzer's memory has always been marked. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, at a small remembrance our family holds at Millbrook Community Church, where she used to sing in the choir before the illness took her breath for that too. It falls, this year, 3.5 weeks after I walked into my own memorial, and Nora asked me gently, a few days before, whether I was ready to stand in front of family and neighbors again so soon after everything that had happened in the last one. I told her I thought Eleanor, of all people, would understand exactly why I needed to. I had one thing left to do before that day arrived, something I had been carrying unopened in a cedar box for 19 years and had finally decided I was ready to face. 2 nights before the remembrance, alone in my bedroom with the false panel of the linen closet moved aside and the old Dieboldzel safe standing open in front of me the way it hadn't in nearly 2 decades, I lifted out the cedar box, opened it, and finally broke the seal on Eleanor's letter. It was shorter than I expected. Eleanor was never a woman who wasted words, not in her sewing, not in her cooking, and not, it turned out, in the last private thing she ever wrote to me. She didn't predict Craig's betrayal. She didn't name Todd Ferran or warn me about a river in September. She wrote about worry in the way any dying mother worries, general, aching, unbearably ordinary. She worried the children would grow up believing love meant never having to ask for anything, because that's what I'd shown them their whole lives. She worried I would keep giving long after giving had stopped being kind, because I had never learned, in my own childhood, that a man's love could have edges without losing its warmth. She asked me, in the last line of that letter, to promise her one thing, not that I would protect our children from every hard thing life sent their way, but that I would let them learn, eventually, to stand up under their own weight. Because a father who never lets his children fall is not protecting them. He's only postponing the fall to somewhere higher up, where it will hurt more when it finally comes. I sat on the edge of our bed and cried for the first time since the accident. Not for Craig, not for Deborah, not even entirely for Eleanor, but for the specific, unbearable ache of reading, 19 years too late, the exact warning I had needed and had been too afraid to open when it might still have changed something. I do not know if reading that letter sooner would have made a different man of my son. I will never know that. But I know I carried it into that remembrance 2 days later, folded in my jacket pocket, and I knew, walking into that church, that whatever happened there, I was finally ready to stop postponing the fall. I did not tell Nora what the letter said. Not that first night, not even the next morning, though she must have seen it in my face at breakfast. The particular kind of quiet that comes after a man has finally set down something heavy he's been carrying so long he forgot it had weight, What I told her instead, over coffee, was smaller and truer than anything I could have said about the letter itself. I think I finally understand what your mother was trying to teach me before she died, honey. I just wish it hadn't taken losing myself in a river to make me ready to hear it. Nora reached over and squeezed my hand, the same gesture she'd repeated so many times in the last month that it had become its own kind of language between us, and said, "Mom always said you were the most stubborn, gentle man she ever met. I think that's just another word for the same thing." Ely spent that afternoon at the kitchen table with me, working through a worksheet of multiplication tables while I sat across from him, restringing an old set of picks I hadn't touched since before the accident, more out of habit than any real need. He worked in silence for a while, tongue between his teeth in concentration, and then set his pencil down and looked at me with the same directness he'd brought to the porch that first week. "Grandpa, is Uncle Craig going to go to jail?" I set the picks down and gave him the same honesty I'd been trying to give everyone else in this story, including myself. "I don't know, buddy. That's not really up to me, or even up to him anymore. Not entirely. It's up to what he does from here forward, and to some people whose job it is to figure out what's fair. But you're not mad at him anymore?" "I'm still working on that part. Being mad and being done with someone aren't the same thing, and neither one of those is the same as loving someone. I think your uncle and I are going to be working all three of those out for a long time." Ellie nodded, the same slow, serious nod he'd given me on the porch weeks earlier, and went back to his multiplication tables like the conversation had settled something in him too. And I thought, watching him, that if nothing else came out of this whole ordeal, at least one small person in this family was growing up, watching the adults around him try to tell the truth instead of managing each other, and that alone felt like it might be worth something, eventually, even if I couldn't yet see the shape of what. The morning of the remembrance came in gray and still, the kind of early autumn morning where the mist sits low over the fields outside Millbrook and doesn't burn off until well past 9. I put on the same dark sweater I'd worn to more funerals than I cared to count over 63 years, and Nora drove us to the church in near silence, both of us watching the same fog roll past the windows, both of us thinking, I suspect, about a different drive nearly a month earlier when neither of us had known whether this day would ever come. Craig called that morning before we left, his voice steadier than it had been on the phone, days earlier. "I talked to Agent Rourke yesterday, Dad. Gave him everything, every email, every instruction Todd ever sent me, every account number I had access to. He said it'll help, cooperating this early. I don't know what happens to the firm. I don't know what happens to me, honestly. But I wanted you to know before today, in case things happen there that make it hard to say afterward." I told him I was proud he'd made that call, and I meant it, though pride and disappointment can sit in the same chest at the same time without canceling each other out. A lesson this whole month had taught me more thoroughly than I'd ever wanted to learn it. "Will you be there today?" I asked him. "At the church? If you want me there." "Your mother would want you there, Craig. That's not the same question as whether I'm ready to sit next to you yet, but it's the one that matters more today." He was quiet for a moment and then said, in a voice that cracked slightly on the last word, "Then I'll be there." Deborah, he told me before we hung up, had left the house 2 days earlier and hadn't answered a single call since, and neither of us said anything more about that, because there wasn't anything left to say that the silence itself wasn't already saying more clearly. We arrived at Millbrook Community Church a little before 10, the small stone building where Eleanor had sung every Sunday for 30 years, where I had married her, where we had, 22 years apart, held 2 funerals that were never supposed to become the same kind of ceremony for the same kind of reason. The parking lot was fuller than usual for a simple remembrance. More cars than a family gathering typically draws, and I felt something in my chest tighten, the old locksmith's instinct that reads a room before it's even fully entered. The sense that whatever was about to happen inside those doors was going to be bigger than the quiet hour of hymns and memory I'd been expecting. I did not know it yet, but I was about to walk into a church that had somehow become the second gathering place in a single month, where every unresolved thread of this story would finally pull tight at once. And this time, I intended to be the one holding the end of the rope. The service itself was small and plain, the way Eleanor would have wanted it. Hymns she used to sing, a short reading from Pastor Whitfield, who'd known our family for 30 years and had the good sense not to mention anything about rivers or memorials or any of the strangeness that had swallowed our family whole this past month. Craig sat 2 rows behind Nora and me, alone, in a dark suit that looked a size too loose on him, like the last few weeks had taken something physical out of him, along with everything else. Deborah did not come. I noticed several people glancing at the empty space beside my son, and then looking quickly away, the particular Millbrook courtesy of noticing everything and saying nothing until it was safe to. It happened during the reception afterward. In the church's fellowship hall, over coffee in styrofoam cups, and a sheet cake someone's sister had baked, the kind of ordinary gathering that has followed every important event in this town for as long as I can remember. I was standing near the coffee urn with Sal when Deputy Hollis Bramwell, a heavy-set young officer I'd known since he was a boy running errands for his grandmother's shop, came through the side door looking for me specifically, his eyes scanning the room until they found mine. "Mr. Hayes, sorry to interrupt. Could I have a word outside?" I followed him into the small vestibule off the fellowship hall, close enough to the room, but private enough that whatever needed saying wouldn't become a spectacle for 40 grieving neighbors holding paper plates of cake. That mattered to me. I had learned enough in the last month about what happens when private things get said too loudly in public rooms. "State police picked up Todd Ferron 2 hours ago," Deputy Bramwell said quietly. "Trooper spotted his car at a rest stop off I-71, matched the plate to an alert the Division of Securities put out this morning after your son's statement went through. He had 2 packed suitcases and about $11,000 in cash in the trunk. Wasn't hard to figure out where he was headed." He paused, glancing back toward the fellowship hall where the sound of quiet conversation and Nora's laugh, still a little too bright, a little too relieved, drifted through the prop door. "I thought you'd want to hear it from someone who knew you, before it made its way around town some other way." I thanked him, and I meant it, because he was right. That was exactly the kind of thing that needed to reach me quietly, in a vestibule, from someone I trusted, rather than shouted across a fellowship hall over sheet cake. I did not go back inside and announce it. I found Craig instead, sitting alone at the edge of the room, and told him quietly, just the fact of it, nothing more, because whatever numbers and account names belonged in a courtroom later, they didn't belong at his mother's remembrance. Not today. Craig set down his coffee cup very carefully, like his hands weren't entirely sure they'd hold steady otherwise, and was quiet for a long moment. "It's really over, then. Whatever he was planning, his part of it is. Yours is still yours to finish, son. But yes, that piece of it is done." He nodded, and something in his shoulders came down a fraction, not relief exactly. More like a man setting down a weight he'd been bracing against so long he'd forgotten what his spine felt like without it. And then, in a voice pitched just for me, not loud, not performed, he said the sentence I have carried with me every day since, the one I believe, more than any apology, marked the actual turn in my son. "I don't want to be a man who needs somebody else holding up his house anymore, Dad. Not Todd. Not you. I think I need to find out what I'm like when I'm the one doing the holding." I did not tell him that was exactly the sentence his mother had been trying to write me 19 years ago, in a letter I'd been too afraid to open until 2 nights before this one. Some things a father keeps for himself a little while longer, just to hold on to the shape of them. We had not been standing there 5 minutes when Nora appeared in the vestibule doorway, drawn, I think, by some instinct she'd developed over the last month for knowing when her father and brother needed a third person in the room to hold the space steady between them. She looked between us, read whatever was written on our faces, and did something none of us expected. She crossed the small vestibule and pulled both of us into a hug, tight, 3-way, awkward the way hugs between people who don't often touch each other tend to be. Craig's arm stiff at first and then, slowly, coming around both of us, and I felt something in my own chest crack open in a way it hadn't in 19 years, Not since the last time all three of us had stood this close together, at Eleanor's actual funeral, too grief-stricken then to know how to hold each other properly. "I'm not doing this again," Nora said into my shoulder, her voice thick. "Either of you. I don't care what it cost either one of you to stay honest with each other from here forward. But I already buried my father once this year, and I am not standing in another vestibule listening to this family fall apart in whispers ever again." Neither Craig nor I said anything to that. There wasn't anything worth saying that would have improved on the truth of it. When we walked back into the fellowship hall a few minutes later, something had shifted in the room, the particular quiet attentiveness of a small town that already half knows something has happened and is waiting, with more grace than people give small towns credit for, to see whether it's their place to ask. Nobody asked. What happened instead was smaller and, to me, far more moving. One by one, over the next half hour, a dozen different people found some reason to cross the room and stand near Craig, near me, near Nora, not saying much, just present. The way Millbrook has always shown up for its own, quietly, without announcement. The same way Sal had shown up in his driveway, with a key and a pot of coffee, 3 weeks earlier. Mrs. Alvarez from the hardware store brought Craig a second slice of cake he hadn't asked for, and sat with him a while, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, her grandson's soccer season, the ordinary kindness of a woman who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer a man carrying shame is simply proof that the world still has room for him in it. I found Eli near the dessert table, solemnly studying a plate of cookies like the decision mattered a great deal, and crouched down beside him despite the way my knee complained about it. "You doing okay, buddy?" He nodded, then looked up at me with the same directness that had undone me twice already in this story. "Grandpa, everybody keeps hugging Uncle Craig today. Does that mean he's not the bad guy anymore?" I thought about that question longer than an 8-year-old probably expected me to. "I think people can do bad things without being bad people forever, Eli. Your uncle did something that hurt me very badly. He's also spending every day since trying to make it right. As much as a person can make a thing like that right. Both of those things are true at the same time. That's most of what being grown up turns out to be, I think, learning to hold two true things at once without needing one of them to cancel out the other." He considered that with the same seriousness he'd brought to every hard question in this story. And then, because he was still 8, and there is only so long a boy that age can sit with something heavy before he needs a lighter thing to hold instead, he asked if he could have 2 cookies instead of 1. And I told him that today, of all days, I thought that was probably fine. The weeks that followed unspooled slower than the month that preceded them, the way real healing almost always does, without the tidy structure of a courtroom drama or a single decisive confrontation. Todd Ferran was formally charged 6 weeks later with securities fraud and grand theft, based largely on the Byerly complaint, the Wren complaint, Marguerite's transaction records, and a certain cassette tape that Agent Rourke told me, off the record, had been unusually persuasive evidence for something recorded by a 15-year-old church sound system, never designed to catch anyone at anything. Deborah was never criminally charged. Cooperation with investigators and the modest, traceable nature of her payments working in her favor, but her marriage to my son did not survive what came out in the process. And the last I heard, she had moved to Columbus and was, according to Nora, who still occasionally heard from mutual friends, trying to build something honest out of whatever was left. I found, when I searched myself for anger toward her, mostly a tired kind of pity instead. Todd Ferran had built his whole life finding people's weakest points and pressing on them until something gave. Deborah had simply been one more lock he'd learned to pick before he ever tried mine. Craig's firm did not survive either, not in the form he'd built it. He cooperated fully with the investigation, testified against Todd when it came to that, and eventually pled to a lesser charge related to his own negligence in overseeing the accounts, a fine, 3 years of probation, a professional censure that will likely keep him out of financial advisory work for a long while, if not permanently. I sat in that courtroom the day he was sentenced, in the same wooden chairs I'd sat in the day my own death was undone. and watched my son stand up straight and accept every word of it, without flinching, without excuse. And I understood, watching him, that whatever this ordeal had cost our family, it had also finally given my son the one thing 38 years of my checkbook had never managed to hand him: the plain, unshielded experience of standing in a room and facing exactly what he'd earned. I did the paperwork for Eli's college fund myself, at the same bank where I'd once repaired the vault by hand for $6 an hour, structured through a trust with an independent guardian, untouchable until he turns 18, in nobody's name but his own. When Craig found out, he didn't ask why I hadn't done the same for him at that age, which I think, more than almost anything else he's done since the river, told me how much he'd actually begun to understand about the difference between being protected and being loved. I still keep the old brass padlock on its hook by the kitchen door. Some mornings, when the light comes in low and gray the way it did that first terrible night, I take it down and open it, just to prove to myself that my hands remember how that whatever broke in me standing in that vestibule has been, slowly, deliberately, put back together, the way I've put together 1,000 mechanisms in a life spent learning that nothing worth protecting stays sealed forever, without someone choosing, again and again, to trust the hand that holds the key. Eleanor's letter sits now beside her photograph on our nightstand, no longer locked away behind a false panel in a linen closet, because I have finally learned the thing she spent her last conscious weeks trying to teach a stubborn, gentle man who thought love meant never letting anyone fall. Some doors are worth opening long before you feel ready. The waiting doesn't make you safer. It only makes the mechanism harder to turn when the day finally comes that you have no choice left but to try. I think about that vestibule often, the rain on my coat, the organ music behind the chapel doors, my own son's voice telling the world I was better off dead. I do not forgive easily what I heard that day, and I have stopped pretending forgiveness and forgetting are the same instrument, or that either one opens on the first try. But I walked into my own memorial a broken, soaked, forgotten old man, and I walked out of the year that followed something I had not expected to become again at 63. A father whose door, at last, is only ever locked from the inside, and only ever for the right reason, not the easy one.